People who passed through the Redstone Valley in those years would tell you, if you caught them in the right mood, that the place had a way of making small things last longer than they should. A conversation that ought to have been forgotten by the next morning would still be circulating 6 months later, passed from one trading post to the next, carried in saddlebags and coat pockets the way people carry things they didn't mean to hold on to. Most of what traveled through that valley was useful: news of water sources, warnings about washed-out crossings, word of which ranches were hiring and which had gone under. But occasionally something else moved through, something that didn't have a practical purpose, something that had simply stuck to people because it was the kind of story a person needs to repeat, not because it proves a point, but because telling it feels like setting down a weight you didn't know you were carrying. That was how the story of Emmett Voss began to travel, not with any intention on Emmett's part, not with any design. It moved the way water moves in dry country, finding paths that weren't obvious from the surface, reaching places you wouldn't have predicted, appearing in unexpected corners months after the original source had moved on and made camp somewhere else entirely. Emmett himself would not have called it a story. He would have called it a wet afternoon and a busted wheel, and he would have said that anybody with working hands and half a morning to spare would have done the same. That was, in fact, the first thing he said when he walked into the Arroyo post in late October, and the man behind the counter looked up from the ledger, set down his pen, and said, "You're that cowboy, aren't you? The one who fixed the wagon?" Emmett had taken off his hat, set it on the counter, and said, "Anybody would have done the same." The man behind the counter had looked at him for a long moment, and then said very quietly, "That's the part that makes the story worth telling." To understand what had happened and why it traveled the way it did, you have to go back to the beginning of August, to a stretch of trail that ran along the eastern edge of the territory, between two long ridges of broken sandstone. It was the kind of country that looked severe from a distance, all red and grey and vertical, with very little apparent softness to it. But if you travelled it in the right season, you found that the ridges channeled weather in interesting ways, and that storms that looked like they were going to pass to the north or south would sometimes funnel down into the corridor between the rock walls and sit there, heavy and warm, releasing rain in slow, thorough curtains rather than the sudden, hard downpours that came and went without leaving much behind. August in that corridor was unpredictable in exactly that way. A man who planned to travel dry could find himself 2 hours into the ride, suddenly inside a grey curtain of rain that smelled like wet stone and creosote and showed no sign of lifting. That was the weather Emmett Voss had ridden into on a Thursday morning, 3 days out of a ranch where he had spent 6 weeks working fence and mending equipment before the season wound down, and the foreman had told him, apologetically but clearly, that the ranch couldn't carry extra hands through the winter. Emmett had nodded, collected his wages, packed his gear with the methodical care of a man who had done it many times, and ridden north. He was not headed anywhere specific. That was not unusual for him. In 12 years of working ranches across that territory, he had developed a tolerance for not knowing where the next job would be, a patience with the space between one thing and the next that some men found in alcohol or card games, but that Emmett had simply cultivated as a disposition, the way you cultivate a habit of sleeping on hard ground until it stops bothering you. He was 41 years old, lean through the face and broad in the shoulders from decades of physical work, with hands that were rougher than his age suggested because he had started working full days at 14 and never really stopped. He was not a man who made strong impressions immediately. He spoke when there was something to say and fell into comfortable quiet when there wasn't. His horse, a dark bay gelding he called Pitch, named not for his color but for the way he planted his feet going downhill slowly and with great deliberation, was 15 years old and had the same settled temperament as his rider. The rain had started just past the first narrows, where the sandstone ridges pinched closest together and the trail dropped to cross a dry creek bed that was, by mid-morning, no longer dry. Emmett had pulled his coat from the roll behind his saddle and put it on without stopping, the way you do when rain is clearly committing and not passing. He had adjusted the brim of his hat to shed water and given Pitch a little more rain to navigate the footing as the trail surface changed from packed dirt to something softer and more variable. They had been traveling in the rain for about 40 minutes when he came around a long curve in the trail and saw, about 100 yards ahead, something that had not been there before. A wagon. Pulled partly off the trail to the right, tilted at the kind of angle that tells you immediately something has gone wrong with the wheel situation without needing to get any closer. A mule team of 2, standing with their heads down in the rain, with the particular patient misery of draft animals, waiting for humans to sort something out. And alongside the wagon, 3 figures, 2 standing, 1 crouched near the rear wheel on the low side. Emmett slowed Pitch to a walk. He studied the scene for a moment, the way you study a problem before walking into it, not because he was hesitant, but because he was systematic. He wanted to understand what he was looking at before he arrived with questions. Even from a distance, through the rain, he could see enough. The family was Apache. The man crouching near the wheel was trying to work with the hub. And even at 100 yards, Emmett could see from the angle that the axle had not merely cracked. It had given way, settling the wheel into a position that would not correct itself without being fully removed and addressed. The woman standing at the side of the wagon was watching the man's work with the focused quiet of someone who understood what she was looking at. An older woman, small and wrapped in a blanket that had darkened with rain, sat on the wagon bench, watching the trail in both directions with the calm alertness of someone who had been through a version of this before. Emmett rode up to the edge of the scene, stopped, and waited a moment. The man crouching at the wheel looked up. He was perhaps 35, broad through the chest, with dark eyes that assessed Emmett with directness, but no hostility. The 2 of them regarded each other for a beat that had nothing aggressive in it, just 2 people measuring a situation. "Axel," Emmett said. The man nodded once and said something in his own language, then switched and said in English that was careful and clearly practiced. "The wood. Here." He indicated the point where the axle met the hub housing. Emmett dismounted, tied Pitch to the wagon's sideboard, crouched in the mud next to the man, and looked. It was not as bad as the wagon's lean suggested, which was the first good news. The axle itself had not snapped. It had cracked, significantly, in a place that had likely been under strain for some time. A stress fracture that the rough trail had finally opened past the point of load-bearing. The wheel had slid inward on the shaft, causing the tilt. There was damage to the hub housing as well, a split in the wooden collar that normally kept the wheel's position true, but the split was incomplete. If you had the right materials and enough time, this was fixable. Not permanently, not beautifully, but well enough to travel. Well enough to get the family to wherever they were going and then have a proper wheelwright address the rest. "Do you have rope?" Emmett asked. "And an axe? Or any iron tools in the wagon?" The man looked at the woman. She said something quickly and moved to the wagon's interior, working through what was stored there, with the organized efficiency of someone who knew exactly where everything was. Within a few minutes, she had produced a coil of heavy rope, a hand axe, a wrapped set of iron tools that included a wedge and a small mallet, and 2 pieces of hardwood that looked like they had been carried specifically as spare material for situations that involved breaking things on the trail. Emmett looked at the wood. He picked up both pieces, tested their weight and grain, set one down. He looked at the tools. He looked at the crack in the axle and the split hub housing, calculating. "This is going to take a while," he said to the man, "and it won't be dry." The man looked up at the sky. The rain showed no inclination to stop, and then back at Emmett. He said something that might have been agreement or acknowledgement, or both. They worked. If you had been standing at the edge of that scene, watching, what you would have noticed first was not the difficulty of the work, but the rhythm it settled into. Emmett took the lead on the technical decisions because he had done this kind of repair before. Not many times, but enough to know the sequence. And the Apache man, whose name Emmett would learn was Dakota, followed each step with the quick comprehension of someone who understood mechanical problems even when the specific solution was new to him. They did not share much language, but they shared the language of hands and materials, and the particular shorthand that develops between two people who are both committed to the same task. Emmett would indicate what he needed. Dakota would understand and provide or position accordingly. The woman, Saya, worked in parallel, keeping the mule team calm, adjusting the position of the wagon by small increments when Emmett called out directions, and doing without being asked about a dozen small things that made the work proceed more efficiently. She found a flat stone to use as a working surface for the iron tools. She located a length of leather from the wagon's stores that turned out to be exactly what was needed to reinforce one of the lashing points Emmett was building around the cracked axle. She produced, from somewhere inside the wagon's covered bed, a short-handled digging tool that made it significantly easier to get underneath the axle housing to work on it from below. The old woman on the bench watched all of this and said very little. Occasionally she spoke a few words to Saya, who answered briefly, and once she spoke to Dakota in a tone that might have been directive or might have been approval. Emmett couldn't read it from outside the language. At one point, during a long stretch when Emmett was working alone on the axle binding and Dakota had stepped away to deal with the mule team, the old woman looked at Emmett directly and said something in her own language. He looked up. She held his gaze and said it again, not louder, just repeated, as if giving him a second chance to understand. He didn't understand, but he nodded, because there was something in her tone that was not a question. She seemed satisfied with this and looked back out at the trail. The rain continued. Emmett's coat was doing its job, but his boots had long since stopped being useful against the water, and the ground around the wagon had churned from soft soil into something that was closer to a slow, thick paste that sucked at your feet when you moved. None of this was remarkable. Mud was an occupational reality for anyone who worked outdoors in that territory, and Emmett had long ago stopped cataloging discomforts that were not actually impairing his ability to work. What he was cataloging, in the quiet, systematic way that was simply how his mind operated, was the repair itself. He was building a solution from available materials that had to serve a specific purpose. Not elegance, not permanence, but functional integrity under the load of a loaded wagon over rough trail. The lashing he was constructing around the cracked section of the axle combined rope under tension with the wedge driven into the crack itself, closing the split and then binding it against reopening. The piece of hardwood from the wagon's spare materials was cut to a length that bridged the hub housing split, serving as a splint, held in place by a second lashing of rope, wrapped in a pattern that distributed pressure evenly rather than concentrating it at the point of damage. It was not a thing of beauty, but when Emmett had Dakota help him reposition the wheel on the axle, and they both put weight on the repaired section, testing it, the assembly held without flex or creak. Emmett rocked the wheel. He pressed downward on the axle at 2 points on either side of the repair, simulating the compression of load. He had Dakota climb onto the wagon bench and add his weight, and he watched the repair under that added load. Nothing moved that should not have moved. The binding was tight and the splint was seated properly. If that story is keeping you here, and something tells me it is, subscribing to this channel means you won't miss a single one of these. Go slow on hills, Emmett said. He pointed at the repair and then mimed a slow descent, exaggeratedly deliberate, and Dakota understood and nodded. And if there's a wheelwright in the next settlement, have them look at it before you go much further. He paused, realizing this was a lot of words for someone whose English was limited. He held up 2 fingers, pointed at the repair, and made a motion like an ongoing journey. Dakota said something to Saya. She answered. He nodded at Emmett and said, in English, 3 days, then a man who makes wheels. Good, Emmett said. They reloaded the tools. Saya brought out something wrapped in cloth from the wagon's interior, flat bread and dried meat, and a round of something that looked like compressed fruit and seed pressed together into a dense cake, the kind of traveling food that is built for caloric density rather than occasion. She held it out to Emmett without ceremony, the way you offer something to someone who has been working alongside you and whose hunger is simply factual. He accepted it the same way. They sat in the partial shelter of the wagon's canvas overhang and ate while the rain continued its conversation with the sandstone ridges above them. The old woman accepted a portion and ate with the slow, deliberate pace of someone for whom meals are still ceremonies, even when taken in the rain on a muddy trail beside a wagon with a patched axle. Dakota ate quickly and then went back to the mule team, checking their harness and adjusting a buckle that had been pulling wrong. Emmett finished his portion and folded the cloth it had come in and handed it back to Saya. She looked at it for a moment and then looked at him and said, slowly, in English, that was more careful than Dakota's, but clearly also practiced. "You know this work. The wood and rope. Ranch work," he said. "Things break. You learn to fix them." She seemed to consider this. Then she said, "What is your name?" He told her. She repeated it once, quietly, as if checking the sound of it. Then she said her own name, and Dakota's name, and the old woman's name, which was Huawei. Emmett repeated each one. He got Huawei slightly wrong on the first try, and Saya corrected him without sharpness, just a small adjustment of the vowel, and he tried again and got it right, and she nodded. That was the last exchange they had before the rain began to slow. Emmett finished a second cup of the tea Saya had made. She had produced a small fire somehow, protected from the rain by a configuration of stones and the wagon's overhang that was clearly the product of long experience. And then he untied pitch from the wagon's sideboard, checked that the gelding was not worse for the long stand in the rain, and mounted. Dakota came around from the mule team side. He looked at Emmett for a moment without speaking, and then he said something in his own language, something that had the cadence of a complete statement rather than a fragment. A few words, deliberate and clear, directed at Emmett the way you direct something at a person when you want them to understand that you mean it even if they can't translate it. Then he went back to the mule team and picked up the reins. Emmett rode north. He thought about the family for the next hour, the way you think about something that sits comfortably in your mind rather than urgently. Just the particular satisfaction of having done a piece of work well, of having arrived at a problem and left it solved. He thought about the axle repair, and whether the binding tension was correct, and decided it was. He thought about Huawei's face when she had looked at him and said those words he hadn't understood, and Dakota's final sentence before he rode away. And he concluded, with the uncomplicated certainty of someone who reads people through actions rather than words, that both had been expressions of genuine regard. Then the trail bent and opened onto a long flat, and the rain was fully gone, and the sandstone ridges were steaming faintly in the returning sun. And Emmett put the whole thing away in the part of his mind where finished things go. He spent the rest of August working his way north, doing day labor at 2 different ranches. By September he had reached the northern part of the territory, where the sandstone gave way to drier, more alkaline country with a different character. Flatter, hotter in the middle of the day and colder at night, with a wind that had a personal quality to it, a directness, like a conversation without preamble. He found a week's work mending and resetting fence posts for a rancher named Creel, who paid modestly, provided good food, and said very little, which Emmett found restful. After that, he drifted east along a ridgeline trail toward the eastern settlements. It was at the first of these, a small cluster of buildings around a central well and a long, low trading post called the Arroyo Post, that the story found him. He had ridden in just before midday, tied pitch at the post's hitching rail, and gone inside to buy flour and dried beans. The man behind the counter was perhaps 60, with a graying mustache and the unhurried manner of someone who had been there a long time and had no plans to change that. His name was Harlan Quist, and after a pause that was about 2 beats longer than ordinary, he said, "You're that cowboy, aren't you? The one who fixed the wagon?" Emmett looked at him. The trading post was empty except for the 2 of them. "I fixed a few wagons," he said. "In the rain," Harlan Quist said. On the Redstone corridor, Apache family, woman and man, and an old one. Word travels, Emmett said. Word travels, Harlan agreed. You're Emmett Voss. I am. Thomas Arriaga came through here about 3 weeks back. He'd been north, through the canyon settlements, and he heard the story from a man who heard it from someone who had camped near that family after you left. Thomas is a talker. He's probably carried it to 6 more places since. Harlan set his pen down and looked at Emmett with the mild, appraising interest of someone who retains the capacity to find things interesting. The way Thomas told it, you spent 4 or 5 hours in the rain fixing a wheel you had no obligation to fix, for people you'd never met and would likely never see again, and then rode on without making anything of it. Emmett said, anybody would have done the same. Harlan Quist said very quietly, that's the part that makes the story worth telling. And there was a silence that was comfortable rather than awkward. Emmett bought his flour and his beans, and Harlan threw in a small cloth of dried apricots for no stated reason. That was the first time. It was not the last. 10 days later, at a water stop called Cutter's Well, a reliable source around which travelers and traders had gathered the way people gather around anything reliable in dry country, a young trader named Cal Mering recognized him before he had a chance to introduce himself. Cal had been moving through the eastern settlements for 3 months and had heard Emmett's name at 4 of them. He said this without ceremony, the way traders report facts. What exactly are people saying? Emmett asked. Cal sat down on a rock beside the trough and thought about it with the slight frown of someone who wants to be accurate. That a man stopped in the rain and spent half a day fixing a broken wagon for an Apache family he didn't know. That he worked alongside the husband without being asked and without making a production of it. That he ate the meal they offered and used their names and rode off north. He paused. The story has reached Apache camps too. Huawei is apparently a figure of some standing in her group, and her account of it carried weight. Emmett said, I didn't do it to be known. Cal Mering looked at him with something that was close to amusement, but was too respectful to be called that. I know, he said. That's why you're known for it. Before Cal rode out, he mentioned as a piece of useful information and nothing more, that there was a ranch 2 days east looking to hire through the winter, good wages, a sound outfit, and the woman who ran it was specifically looking for someone experienced in repair work. She heard the story, Cal said. Figured that a man who can fix a wagon axle in the rain with what's on hand can fix most things. She said, find me that man if he's in this part of the territory. The ranch was 3 days east, as it happened, not 2, because the trail went through a dry stretch that required a wide detour to a water source that had moved. He found it on the evening of the 3rd day, just as the light was going orange and long across a wide, flat-bottomed valley. The main house was stone and timber, serious construction. The barn was large. It was the kind of place built by someone who intended to stay. The woman who came to the gate was perhaps 50, with a direct way of moving and a face that had been dealing with practical problems for a long time. Miriam Quill shook his hand like someone who does not adjust their grip based on who they're meeting. Emmett Voss, she said, Mrs. Quill. I heard you were somewhere in this part of the territory. What I need is someone who can look at everything on this property that's been held together with bad repairs and good intentions for 2 seasons and make it right. Wagons, equipment, the barn's east wall, the water channel on the south range. Can you do that? Most of it, he said. I'd have to look at the water channel. Fair answer, she said. Come and look. He spent the winter at the Quill Ranch, and it was good work, the kind that has a clear shape to it, where you can see what was wrong and see when it's been made right. He worked through the barn's east wall, which turned out to have a foundation problem underneath the visible surface damage. He sorted the equipment shed front to back, found what could be salvaged, and named honestly what couldn't. He addressed the water channel in stages, starting from the highest point and working downstream. Through the autumn and into the winter, Travelers stopped at the Quill Ranch. It was a known stopping point, and Miriam maintained it deliberately, offering water and occasionally a meal in exchange for news. Some of those travelers knew Emmett's name before they arrived. A few had heard the story directly from people who had heard it from the Apache camps. One woman, passing through in October, had actually met Thomas Arriaga, the man who had reportedly set the story moving, and she said his version was accurate in the essentials and embroidered only a little in the details, which Emmett took as high praise for Thomas's integrity. What he found over those months was that the story had traveled in a particular shape. It had not become inflated into something larger than it was. Nobody told it as a dramatic rescue or an act of exceptional generosity. They told it the way you tell a story about someone who simply did what the situation required, completely and without calculation. The value people found in it was not the magnitude of the act, but the plainness of it. That a man had ridden up on a problem and addressed it, and then ridden on, and that the people he had helped had thought enough of this to pass his name forward. Emmett thought about this one night in December, sitting by the fire in the bunkhouse with a cup of coffee and the wind working at the roof in the way it did in that valley, low and persistent. He thought about how little he had meant to do anything memorable. He thought about Dakota's hands on the rope as they worked the binding tight, both of them leaning their weight against the tool, no words needed. He thought about what Harlan Quist had said. That's the part that makes the story worth telling. There was something in that which he had been circling around for months without quite arriving at. The story was not about him. That was the thing. It had traveled not because people were impressed by him, but because the Apache family had wanted to pass something forward. To name a person who had treated them like people worth stopping for, in the rain, without an audience. The story was about the naming. Saya had asked his name deliberately, and Huawei had said those words directly at him, and Dakota had spoken that final sentence before Emmett rode away, all of it intentional. They had committed his name to memory, and then released it into the territory like something you place carefully where it will be found. He had thought of it as a fixed wagon. They had thought of it as a record. Not a monument, just an accurate record of a man who had done a thing worth knowing. And they had understood, the way people understand who have lived long in country where reliable things are scarce, that an accurate record of a good person is worth traveling. In the spring, when the Quill Ranch's most urgent work was done, and Miriam said honestly that she could keep him through the summer if he wanted, but understood if the season made him want to move, Emmett decided to head south, back along the Redstone Corridor, back through the sandstone ridges, back through the country where dry creek beds ran with fast cold water in the runoff. He had no particular plan. A week into the ride south, at a small settlement where he stopped to water pitch and buy supplies, a young Apache man came out of a shade structure near the well and looked at him for a moment, and then said, in careful English, "Emmett Voss?" Emmett looked at him. He was perhaps 18, with intelligent eyes and a stillness to him that suggested he was someone who observed more than he revealed. "Yes," Emmett said. The young man said his name was Noah, and that his grandfather had traveled through this part of the territory last autumn and had stopped at an Apache camp 2 days south of here, and that Huawei was his grandmother's sister. He said this the way a person provides context, not as a prelude to anything dramatic, but as necessary information. Then he reached into the fold of his shirt and produced something small, a piece of worked leather, a circle of it, with a simple pattern pressed into the surface in a way that suggested considerable time and care had gone into it. He held it out to Emmett. Emmett took it. He turned it in his hands. The leather was excellent quality, worked to a smooth suppleness, and the pressed pattern was of a kind he had seen on leather goods made by people who were very good at the craft. It was about the size of his palm. He looked at Noah. "From Huawei," Noah said. "She knew you would come south again. She said—" He paused, finding the English. "She said that people who go north always come back south. She wanted you to have this." He paused again. "She said it is your name." What she pressed into the leather. It is the name she gave you in our language. I can say it for you if you want to know. Emmett held the leather in both hands and looked at it. He looked at the pressed pattern that was, apparently, a name. The sun was coming down at the angle that turns everything in that country gold and long, and the sandstone of the nearest ridge had gone a deep copper color that would fade to gray after sunset. The creek near the settlement was running with the last of the spring water, and you could hear it from here, which meant it was still a good flow, which meant the season was still generous. "Tell me," he said. Noah said the name. It was 3 syllables, with a specific stress on the middle one that Emmett would have to practice to get right. He tried it once, imperfectly. "It means," Noah said, "the one who works in rain without asking why." Emmett held the leather circle. He didn't say anything. There was nothing that needed saying. He stood in the gold afternoon light with Pitch's reins in one hand and Huawei's gift in the other. And he thought about a wet Thursday in August, a muddy trail between sandstone ridges, a family with a broken wagon, and a repair that had held for 3 days and probably longer than that. He thought about all the places his name had traveled while he had simply been moving from one job to the next, not thinking much about any of it, doing what the situation required, and then riding on. The creek kept running. Pitch shifted his weight on the packed earth, that slow, deliberate way he had. Noah watched Emmett with the calm patience of someone who has delivered something important and is willing to wait for the recipient to arrive at it in their own time. Eventually, Emmett put the leather circle into the breast pocket of his coat, close to the seam, where it would not shift around. He thanked Noah, and Noah nodded once, and that was enough for both of them. He rode south into the copper afternoon, following the creek sound until the trail bent away from it and the settlement was behind him, and the only sounds were Pitch's hooves on the trail and the wind and the particular wide-open quiet of country that has enough room in it for a person to exist inside without crowding anything. Whatever road comes next for him, he carries that name now. That seems like enough. If this story reached something in you, hit subscribe. These are the ones worth keeping.